Hey everybody, this is Modern Refugee. Having a little tea right now, and I wanted to shoot a video talking a little bit about how the old timers put their communities together and some of the things that they grew um, to build those communities and some of the things that they did. There's a lot of talk on YouTube and stuff about prepping communities and preparedness communities and getting groups of people together and stuff. Well, the old timers did that. They had to do that to build the towns that basically we all live in now out here in rural America. And little history on our area here. Um, our area was basically settled after the Civil War. Michigan was basically a vast wilderness. North of the large cities that you are all familiar with that are in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula today. Everything north of that was raw wilderness, and that was the areas that were settled. And there was a few constants in any community that was started, and the first couple of things that were put up were sawmills and grits mills to grind grain, because they had to have a way to build shelter and they had to have a way to make food. Food and shelter were the two most important things, and a lot of the communities were. Especially here in the Great Lakes, relied on the waterways, and they those waterways predated most roads, because what we would consider roads today were basically just trails. And most roads, if you look out in rural America, were built on the trails that the natives had prior to that. And in our area here, there was some crops that were grown that were actually really did really well in our area, and there are things that we as preppers don't think about today. Some of those crops were common, what you would think of, wheat and potatoes, these kind of things, orchards, stuff like apples, and these things we all are kind of accustomed to today. But there were things that were grown in this area here that they basically don't grow anymore, because everything's went over to basically monoculture type agriculture. But things like oats and peas were huge around here. They were huge crops around here back 100 years ago, because those were the things that they needed to survive. They needed those crops to feed their livestock. They needed those crops to trade and to have commerce. And a lot of these small communities had basically two classes of people that worked in symbiotic relationships, and they were farmers and there was merchants. And you either were one or the other. You either produced the stuff or you were the merchant that took it to market. And um, if you Google farmers and merchants, it's actually a very common name for banks nationwide right now. And that's where the whole farmer and merchant thing came from, was these communities that were built basically from the grounds up. And around here, um, oats, barley, like I said, peas, beans, these were all the crops that were more common before the large crops that we have today. Now, there was some corn that was grown too, but it's not the corn that we think of today. And a lot of the farmers, they would reserve a majority of what they grew to feed their own livestock, to feed themselves. They would take the wheat and the oats and stuff that they grew, and that would go up to the grits mill, and that would be ground. And it gets to another thing. Kind of the livestock feed. A lot of the formulas that they fed the animals back then were a lot different than today. Today, you go and you look for like chicken feed at a Tractor Supply or whatever, you're going to see a lot of stuff like extruded pellets. They didn't have that back then. Even back when I was a kid, I can remember my mother going up to the co-op, and she would basically give a recipe to the co-op, say, I want some, and they called it chop back then, where they would grind a certain amount of corn, a certain amount of oats, a little bit of wheat. That would all get ground in. It would make this sort of like a mash, and they would mix that with a little bit of water and give it to the chickens. And from what I remember, the chickens laid eggs like crazy on this mash. Nothing was this, these extruded pellets and stuff that they have today. And other industries grew up around these production practices. Like around here, we had a actual cider and what they called cider and jelly works. And it started around 1900 and it basically went up into the 1970s. And these cider and jelly works, if you had an orchard or you had a vineyard, you would take that stuff that you produced, your grapes, your apples, your pears, or whatever, you would take that to these places and they would process that for you, and they would take that, some of that stuff to market. You would give them a certain amount of your product, and you would get a certain amount back for yourself, and the rest you would sell to make extra money. And that's how a lot of these small rural communities, they got started. They had a way in. They had a transportation network, either by water or by trail, however that it was, and they would set up things to, for shelter, for food, and then later for commerce. And that's how these communities grew. And when you look at a lot of these things are still going to exist. If something bad happens, something that would knock us back 100 years, some type of either natural or man-made catastrophe, that's how communities are going to grow again. There's going to be basic things that people need, and there's going to be people that are going to produce those things, and things are going to grow from there. So even if the worst happens, human nature is going to revert back to those practices. And I thought it was interesting. I've always thought these types of things were interesting, and so how do these older ways of doing things, if you look at them close enough, they all have knowledge to share with people in the modern preparedness mindset, because these things will exist and these ideas will exist even if the modern things that we have today go away. But anyway, this is Modern Refugee. Thought you guys would just get a little information, a little entertainment here out of this commentary, kind of on my recollections and the old way of doing things and how they relate back to how we live and how we prepare today. But anyway, appreciate you guys out there. You guys take care.